1. The woman in the creek bed. It was early spring, that awkward in-between when the mornings still bite, but the afternoons carry the damp smell of thawed earth and moss. I'd been up in the Blue Ridge for a couple of days, staying at a friend's hunting cabin while he was out of state. The cabin was tucked 1.5 miles off the nearest road, and the only way in was by foot or ATV. No cell service, no neighbors in shouting distance. Just quiet. That morning, I decided to hike down to a creek I hadn't visited in years. Back when I was younger, I'd pulled some fat trout from there, and the thought of fishing it again felt like a good way to spend the day. The air was thick with fog, the kind that hangs low enough to blur the tree line and soak through your clothes without you realizing it. It muffled everything. No wind, no birds, just the slow, steady sound of water curling around rocks. I found a shallow stretch about knee-deep and started working my way along it, casting into the deeper pockets. After maybe an hour, I noticed something upstream. At first, it barely registered, just a shape, crouched low in the water, still enough that it could have been a boulder. But as I focused, I saw her, a woman. She was hunched over, hands cupped, bringing water to her mouth like she hadn't had a drink in days. Her hair was long and tangled into thick ropes that dripped steadily into the creek. Mud streaked her arms and shoulders, her skin pale beneath, almost gray in the morning light. I thought maybe she'd been hiking and gotten lost. Out here, that happened more than you'd think. People underestimate these mountains, forget how quickly you can lose the trail. I called out to her. Something simple, ma'am, are you all right? But she didn't move. Didn't turn her head, didn't even twitch. The only sound was the gentle scoop and pour of water between her hands. I took a step closer, and that's when the smell hit me. It wasn't rotten, not exactly. It was something sour and unwashed, like wet fur left in the sun. It clung to the back of my throat, metallic and damp all at once. My stomach rolled. She stood up so fast that my body stiffened before my mind caught up. There was no gradual push against the water, no shifting of weight, no human stagger. Just one sharp, fluid movement, like she'd been coiled there waiting. Her back stayed to me, her head still tilted slightly toward the creek, as though she were listening to it. Then she began walking upstream, if you can even call it walking. There was something off about it. Her knees barely bent, her shoulders didn't sway. Her arms hung stiff and angled away from her sides, fingers curled loosely. I watched the way her legs moved through the water. There should have been ripples, the little wave that forms ahead of your shin when you wade in current. But the creek around her calves stayed eerily still, not frozen, just untouched. I should have turned around then, headed back to the cabin, pretended I'd never seen her. But something in me, it wasn't courage, not really, made me follow. Maybe it was that ingrained Appalachian thing about not leaving someone alone if they might be in trouble. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I just didn't want to admit to myself how wrong it felt. The fog thickened as I trailed her, and the air grew colder, enough that the hairs on my arms prickled beneath my jacket. Every step I took was loud, the dull splash of water, the grind of stones under my boots. She made no sound at all. We went on like that for maybe 50 yards before the creek bent sharply to the left. She stepped into the fog at the curve, and when I followed seconds later, she was gone. The bank on either side was steep and muddy. Climbing out without a sound would have been impossible. I stopped, scanning the edges, listening for any sign of her. Nothing. That's when I saw the footprints. 2 sets in the narrow strip of mud along the water's edge. Mine. And another set, smaller, barefoot. They started just a few feet behind where my own began, each one placed directly in line with mine, heel to toe, as though someone had been stepping exactly where I'd stepped, the whole way. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. My chest felt tight, and my hands had started to shake, though I told myself it was just the cold. I turned back downstream, quick but not running. Running felt like it would invite something worse. The fog closed in around me, the trees looming dark at the edges of my vision. Once I thought I heard a ripple in the water behind me, but when I looked, it was empty. I kept moving, not letting myself glance back again. When the cabin came into sight through the fog, my legs nearly gave out from relief. I sat on the porch steps for a long while before going inside, telling myself I'd just seen a lost hiker. That the footprints had been there before. That night, lying in bed, I woke to the sound of water dripping. Not from the roof or sink, this was slower, heavier. Each drop hit the wooden floor with a distinct pat. I didn't move. The sound went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. The silence after was worse. In the morning by the door I found them, wet prints, bare, smaller than mine, leading away into the trees. I left that afternoon. I've never gone back to that creek. And I don't fish alone anymore. Not because I'm afraid of getting lost, because I'm afraid of finding her again.
2. The hollow eyes behind the barn. When my uncle first called me about helping him with his place up in the mountains, I didn't think much of it. He wasn't the kind of man to ask for help unless he needed it, so I figured it was serious work. The cabin had been in the family for decades, tucked far off the main road in a hollow you wouldn't find unless you already knew it was there. As a kid, I'd visited a couple of times with my parents, but never stayed overnight. I remembered the smell of wood smoke, the way the hills seemed to close in on all sides, and how at night the dark felt thicker than anywhere else I'd ever been. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up was the barn. It sat behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards back, half hidden by a stand of poplars. Even from the drive, I could see the roof sagging in the middle, the front wall leaning forward like it wanted to spill into the yard. It looked ready to give up. My uncle saw me staring and told me flat out that it wasn't safe, that the beams were rotted through. He said it in that way where the conversation was over before it started. The cabin itself wasn't much better. It leaned slightly to the right, like it had been settling unevenly for years. The porch sagged so deep in the middle that the boards creaked under my boots. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. Mismatched furniture, a wood stove with a thin stovepipe, and the smell of old pine and dust. My uncle's dog, an old shepherd mix named Gus, followed me in and immediately curled up in front of the stove. We spent that first day clearing brush from around the cabin and fixing loose shingles on the roof. It was the kind of work that leaves you bone-tired but satisfied. My uncle didn't say much while we worked, and I didn't push him. He was a quiet man even on his best days. By the time the sun went down, the woods had gone completely still. No crickets, no frogs, just silence thick enough that you noticed your own breathing. I sat out on the porch after my uncle went to bed, listening. In the distance, I thought I heard something, a faint scrape, like wood on dirt, but it was so far off, I couldn't place it. The second night, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a rough floor. I looked toward the barn, but the moonlight barely touched it through the trees. Gus lifted his head, ears pricked, and gave a low whine. "Raccoons," I told him, more for my benefit than his. But the sound didn't have the quick, scurrying energy of an animal. It was deliberate, steady. I got the flashlight from the hook by the door and started across the yard. The grass was damp with dew, and the cold bit through the knees of my jeans. Halfway there, the dragging stopped. The silence after felt heavier than before. The barn doors were open just enough to see a strip of darkness inside. One door hung crooked, the hinge groaning when I pushed it. The smell inside hit me first, a mix of old hay, damp rot, and something sour I couldn't place. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight, swirling like tiny insects. Cobwebs draped from the rafters, swaying in the draft. I scanned the space slowly. Old tools hung rusted on the walls. A broken ladder leaned in the corner, and there were mounds of hay so old they'd turned grey. Then my light landed on the far corner. She was crouched low, knees pulled up, her hair hanging in thick ropes that hid most of her face. At first, I thought she was a mannequin, the way she was holding still. Her hands were pale and thin, pressed flat into the dirt. "Hey," I called, my voice sounding strange in that hollow space. "You all right?" She didn't answer, didn't even flinch. I stepped forward, the beam of my light sliding up to catch her face, or what little I could see of it. That's when I saw her eyes. They reflected the light, but not like an animal's. There was no flicker, no narrowing against the glare. They just stared, unblinking. Then she hissed. It wasn't high-pitched like a cat's. It was low, drawn out, and angry in a way I can't explain. My stomach knotted instantly and my hands went cold. The sound didn't rise or fall. It stayed steady, like it had been sitting in her throat for hours. I stepped back, my heel catching on a rusted feed bucket. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering against the dirt. The beam whipped around wildly before landing face down, throwing everything into shadow. When I snatched it up again and swung it back to the corner, she was gone. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my ears. I backed toward the door, the beam darting across the floor. That's when I saw it. A small pile of bones in the exact spot she'd been crouched. Too small for deer, but bigger than a rabbit. The skull sat on top, the empty sockets tilted toward me. I didn't want to look too close, but I thought it might be a dog, or something like one. I turned and walked out without looking back. My uncle was on the porch when I got there, barefoot, holding a lantern. His face was set in that same unreadable way, but his eyes, they were hard. "You went into the barn," he said. It wasn't a question. I started to explain, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Don't go near it again." He walked past me, down to the barn, and shut the doors tight. Then he slid the heavy wooden beam across them and locked it with an old iron padlock. He didn't look at me again. We didn't talk about it the next day, or the day after. But every night after that, just as I was falling asleep, I'd hear it, the slow, dragging sound. And each night, it was closer. On my last night there, I woke to Gus whining at the foot of the bed. His ears were flat, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. That's when I heard it again. The dragging. Only this time it was coming from underneath me. It stopped the moment I sat up. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own pulse. The next morning, I packed before the sun was up. My uncle didn't ask why, and I didn't tell him. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. 3. The whistling in the tree line. I was 2 days into a solo backpacking trip in the southern Appalachians when it happened. The ridge trail I was on wasn't popular. Most hikers stuck to the better marked loop trails down by the river, but I'd wanted quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own boots in the leaves and the steady tick of your heartbeat in your ears. It had been a dry summer, so the trail was hard-packed and dusty, the air brittle with heat. On either side, the mountainsides dropped off into steep slopes tangled with laurel and rhododendron. Thick forest swallowed everything beyond 20 or 30 yards, the tree trunks standing so close you could barely see through them. I'd been making good time, but as I rounded a bend, I heard it, a whistle, slow, not quite a tune, not even a rhythm, just a drawn-out series of notes that never seemed to resolve into anything. I stopped and looked down the slope to my left. The sound seemed to be drifting up from the trees below, faint but distinct. My first thought was that it might be another hiker, maybe someone camping off trail. The whistle faded, then stopped entirely. I called out, just a simple hello, and waited. Nothing. No rustle of movement, no voice in return, just the wind moving through the canopy. I shrugged it off and kept walking. A few minutes later I heard it again, louder this time. The hair on my arms prickled. It was coming from behind me now. I stopped again, my pack straps creaking as I shifted my weight. I turned, scanning the trail I'd just come up. Empty. The whistle faded out slowly, like the person was walking away. But then it came back, closer. I don't know why, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't the sound itself, but the way it carried. It didn't have the kind of uneven rise and fall you'd expect if someone was hiking and whistling. It was too steady, almost deliberate. I picked up my pace. My boots crunched on the dry leaves as I kept glancing over my shoulder. The sun was starting to drop behind the ridge, the light flattening into that dim gold that disappears quicker than you think. The whistling followed. Sometimes it was to my left, sometimes to my right, weaving between the trees. Once, I swore it came from both sides at once. I told myself it was just the way sound carried in the mountains, that someone could be 100 yards off and it would still sound close. But deep down, I didn't believe it. About 20 minutes later, I came to a small clearing where the trail widened. The grass here was high and dry, the kind that whispers against your legs. I slowed down, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the shadow of the trees across the clearing, barefoot, pants too short, hanging loose around his narrow waist. His skin looked weathered, like he'd been out in the sun for months, and he was smiling, not just a polite smile, either. His mouth was stretched wide enough that I could see the gaps where teeth should have been. The whistling stopped the moment I saw him. We stood there for what felt like a full minute. I didn't move. Neither did he. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking. Then, without a word, he stepped backward, one slow step, then another, until the shadows swallowed him completely. I didn't hear him turn or walk away, but the whistling started again almost immediately. This time from somewhere behind me, every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but the trail was narrow and rough, and the last thing I wanted was to trip. I started walking as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. My mouth was dry, my hands slick with sweat. The sound followed me for the next mile, always close, always moving. Sometimes it was so near I thought if I turned fast enough, I'd catch him right there on the trail. The sun dropped fully behind the ridge, and the shadows closed in fast. The Appalachian woods are different at night. They go from green and open to black, and endless in the span of a few breaths. I didn't stop until I reached a marked backcountry campsite. It wasn't much, just a fire ring and a flat spot for a tent. But it was the first place in hours where the ground leveled out enough to make me feel like I could catch my breath. I set my pack down and dug out my headlamp, sweeping the beam in a slow arc around the clearing. The trees looked thicker now, the dark between them almost solid. I didn't hear the whistle again that night, but I also didn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I thought I heard movement, a branch snapping, the faint swish of grass. Each time I froze, holding my breath until the silence settled again. At some point, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off. When I woke at first light, there were bare footprints in the dirt around my tent. They weren't fresh enough to be crisp, but they were clear. The heel, the ball of the foot, the spread of the toes. Some circled my tent, some led toward the trail, and some just stopped. Like the person had stood there for a while, watching. I packed up fast. I didn't bother with breakfast. Didn't even refill my water bottle from the creek nearby. For the next 6 miles, I didn't see or hear anyone. No whistle, no footsteps, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the steady thump of my boots. When I finally reached the trailhead, there was a Forest Service truck parked there. The ranger inside leaned out the window as I passed and asked if I'd had a good trip. I hesitated, then told him about the man, about the whistling, about the footprints. His smile faded slowly. "You camping up past Briar Ridge?" he asked. I nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Stay off that ridge when you're alone. We've had reports." I asked what kind of reports. He just shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. You're out." I drove away, but the sound followed me for weeks afterward. In my sleep, in the wind through the trees outside my apartment. Sometimes when I'm walking home at night, I think I hear it again. Faint at first, then louder. I don't turn around anymore. For the footprints under the window. It had been years since I'd spent any meaningful time alone, really alone. The kind of solitude where the nearest person could be a mile away or more, and the only sounds you hear at night are the ones the land makes. My cousin had offered me the cabin for a week while he was away working a job out of state. He'd warned me it was primitive, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, barely any electricity, but I'd been craving quiet, so I agreed without hesitation. The cabin sat at the far end of a narrow dirt road that wound deep into the hardwood forest. The driveway itself was more of a path through underbrush, gravel, and packed mud leading to a small clearing. The cabin was single-story weathered pine boards, a sagging tin roof, and two small windows on the front that seemed almost too small for the size of the place. Out back, the forest pressed in close, so close that from the bedroom window, all you could see were treetops and sky. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my bag, made coffee on the old propane stove, and walked the edge of the property just to get a feel for the place. The air had that damp, earthy smell that comes after days of rain, though the ground was mostly dry except for a few soft patches near the tree line. As evening came on, the forest grew quiet in that way it sometimes does before dark, like everything is holding its breath. I lit a single oil lamp and read until my eyes were heavy. That first night, I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, that faint crunching sound, like someone slowly stepping on loose gravel. But it grew clearer, deliberate. The sound was coming from outside, moving toward the cabin. My bedroom window was set high in the wall. I could only see treetops and part of the roof's overhang from my bed, so there was no way to glance out and check. The crunching stopped directly beneath my window. I lay perfectly still, my pulse thudding in my ears. That's when I heard it. Breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. Not the soft, fast pants of an animal, but controlled exhales, each one just long enough to be intentional. The air inside felt heavy. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe a bear, but deer don't stand still like that, and bears. I'd have heard more movement. This was different. Humans. I didn't move, barely even blinked, until the sound slowly faded back toward the woods. I stayed awake for a long time after, waiting to hear it again, but the night was silent except for the occasional snap of a branch somewhere far off. In the morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was probably just the house creaking or the wind in the trees. But curiosity won out, and I stepped outside to check. The grass was bent in places near the cabin's side, and the soft patch of mud beneath my window was marked with a set of footprints, bare footprints. They were long and narrow. The toes pointed directly toward the house. I followed them back toward the tree line, where they vanished into the undergrowth. That day passed quietly, though my thoughts kept drifting back to those prints. I told myself I'd just happened to catch sight of some drifter passing through, maybe a lost hiker who decided to come close for reasons I didn't understand. But by the second night, when nothing happened, I almost convinced myself the whole thing was a fluke. Same with the third. I started to feel foolish for being so on edge. It was my last night in the cabin when it happened again. I'd gone to bed early, planning to get up at dawn and leave before the sun got too high. Sometime in the dead hours, I woke to that same sound, gravel underfoot, slow and deliberate. My skin prickled instantly. I knew before I was fully awake what I was hearing. My body went tense, every nerve pulled tight. The footsteps stopped again beneath my window. The breathing started, but this time it was louder, closer. I realized with a slow chill that the sound wasn't drifting up from the ground this time. It was right against the glass. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to get up, to grab the flashlight. But I couldn't. I stayed frozen, staring at the dim ceiling while each breath fogged faintly against the pane behind me. The rhythm was steady, almost calm, as if whoever it was knew I was awake and was waiting. The sound went on for what felt like minutes before finally stopping. When I worked up the courage to turn over and look, the window was nothing but a dark square. No face, no figure, just the faint outline of trees beyond. I didn't sleep again after that. In the morning, I stepped outside, heart pounding, expecting to see more prints in the mud, but the ground beneath the window was bare. No marks at all. It's been years since that night, but I still dream of that breathing. Slow, patient, inches from my face, separated only by a sheet of glass. 5. The stranger in the roadside ditch. It was late when I left the job site, later than I wanted. I'd stayed too long, trying to finish the day's work before the rain rolled in, and now I was paying for it. The road I take home isn't the kind you want to be on after dark. It winds through the mountains like it's trying to lose you, hugging the ridges and cutting through hollows so deep the sun barely reaches the bottom even in the middle of the day. Out here, once night falls, it's as if the whole world shrinks down to the stretch of pavement in front of your headlights. I had an old thermos of coffee riding shotgun, half warm and tasting faintly of rust from the metal lid. The windows were up, but the air still carried that thick dampness you get before a storm, the kind that settles in your chest and makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. After the first hour, the road smoothed out into a kind of rhythm. Blacktop, yellow lines, forest pressing in from both sides. I'd seen one truck going the other way about 20 miles back, but otherwise it was just me and the dark. That's the thing about mountain roads at night. You don't realize how alone you are until you catch yourself thinking about what would happen if you broke down. It was somewhere between two hairpin curves that I saw it. A shape in the ditch up ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a deer. That wouldn't be unusual. I'd already seen two earlier in the drive, their eyes catching in the beams before they bounded off into the trees. But as I got closer, I realized the shape wasn't right. It was too narrow, too pale, no fur, no antlers. My foot eased off the gas without me thinking about it. When the brights caught him full on, my stomach went cold. It was a man. He was curled on his side in the shallow ditch, back to the road. His spine arched unnaturally high, and his ribs pushed against skin so thin it looked almost papered over. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a filthy, torn shirt and pants that hung loose around his legs. His feet were bare. Something about the sight made the little hairs on my arms stand up. There's a certain kind of stillness people have when they're sleeping, or passed out, or dead. This man didn't have that. Even though he wasn't moving, there was a tension in the way his body was curled, like a spring wound too tight. I rolled the passenger side window down halfway, letting in the damp smell of earth and wet leaves. "You all right, buddy?" My voice came out louder than I meant, too sharp in the stillness. Before I could say another word, he moved. Not like someone waking up, not groggy or slow. One moment he was curled tight, the next he was on his feet, facing away from me, shoulders hunched. He never looked at the car. He didn't hesitate. He just bolted into the trees with a speed that didn't seem possible on that uneven ground. The ditch sloped sharply up into thick underbrush, but he didn't stumble, didn't even break stride. The beams caught the pale flash of his back as he slipped into the shadows, and then he was gone. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds, long enough for my pulse to spike and for a cold, uneasy feeling to settle in my gut. I sat there another moment, listening. No footsteps, no rustling, just the quiet hum of my engine. It crossed my mind to get out, maybe check if he'd dropped anything. But I didn't. Something in me, call it instinct or just plain sense, told me not to step out of the car, not here. I put the window up and pressed the gas a little harder than before. For the next 10 minutes, I kept catching myself checking the mirrors. Nothing but darkness behind me, but my mind wouldn't let it go. The way he'd moved, It wasn't like any runner I'd ever seen. It was too smooth, too certain. People stumble when they run full tilt in the dark, especially through brush. He didn't. And then there was the way he hadn't looked at me. Not even a glance. Not even when I'd spoken. Like I wasn't there at all. I tried to shake it off. People live rough out here. You hear stories. Folks who disappear into the mountains, living off whatever they can catch. Staying away from towns. Sometimes they've got reasons. Sometimes it's just something in their head that makes them want to be away from everyone. I told myself he was one of those, but deep down, I didn't believe it. About a mile or two later, the road straightened out for a stretch, cutting between two steep ridges. I just started to relax again when I saw him. I didn't register it at first, just a pale shape in the distance, standing dead center in the lane. I eased off the gas, squinting. My brights hit him, and my mouth went dry. It was the same man. He was facing me now, arms hanging loose at his sides, head tilted sharply to the left. Too sharply. His chin was practically brushing his collarbone, and it didn't look like any kind of natural posture. His eyes, if they were open, were lost in the shadows of his brow, but I could see his chest rise and fall. Slow, steady. He didn't flinch at the light. The car crept forward, tires crunching grit on the asphalt. He didn't move, didn't wave me down, didn't step aside, just stood there like he'd been waiting. I could feel my hands tightening on the wheel, knuckles aching. Something in me screamed to turn around, but the road behind me was as empty and dark as the one ahead. The closer I got, the more wrong he looked. His skin had that same sickly pallor I'd seen in the ditch, stretched too thin over bones that seemed too sharp. His feet were still bare, toes pale against the blacktop. I was maybe 20 feet away when his head twitched. Just a small jerk, not turning toward me, not lifting, more like a sudden, involuntary spasm. That was enough. I yanked the wheel right, swerving hard into the opposite lane. The tires screamed, and the car fishtailed before I got it straightened out. By the time I looked in the mirror, the road was empty. No man, no shadow, nothing. I drove the rest of the way home with every muscle in my body clenched. Even when I finally hit a stretch with cell service, I didn't stop. I kept going, windows up, doors locked, headlights carving that narrow tunnel through the black. I never saw him again, but I think about him every time I drive that road at night. Every time my brights wash over the ditches and I see the pale flash of something that might be skin. 6. The voices beyond the hollow. It was early October, that awkward time in the Appalachians when the nights turn cold, but the days can still hold on to a touch of summer. My buddy Caleb and I had decided to take a weekend and camp out near an old hollow neither of us had been to before. The place didn't have a name on the map, just a blank patch where the contour lines bunched up and disappeared into darkness. Locals called it the Hollow Past Briar Ridge, which sounded more like a warning than a direction. Still, we'd been chasing that sort of quiet you can only find far from paved roads, so it seemed like a good spot. We parked Caleb's old Tacoma at the end of a barely there logging road and hiked the last 2 miles in. The forest thickened the deeper we went, the trees pressing close, their limbs knitted together in a way that made the sky seem like an afterthought. Every step took us farther from any sign of the modern world. By the time we reached the hollow, even the air felt different, cooler, heavier, carrying the smell of damp leaves and earth that had been undisturbed for too long. The place was beautiful in a severe way. Towering oaks and hickories rose out of the slope like the columns of a forgotten cathedral. Fallen leaves blanketed the ground so thickly that every step sounded muffled, like the forest was swallowing the noise. The hollow itself was a dip between ridges. The kind of place that collects shadows long before the sun actually sets. We set camp just outside the lowest point, on a patch of ground that seemed level enough. The fire pit was simple, a ring of stones, enough to keep the flames contained. Caleb got the tent staked while I worked on getting the fire going. By the time we had a steady blaze, the light had already started to fade in that subtle, creeping way the mountains have. For the first few hours, it was everything we'd hoped for. We cooked some cheap cuts of steak on the fire, traded stories, and let the night settle in around us. The sound of the wind in the trees was constant, whispering high above. Every now and then, a twig would snap somewhere in the dark. But that's part of the deal when you camp. Deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. Nothing to get worked up over. It was probably around midnight when I first noticed it. I'd been staring into the fire, half dozing in that warm, hypnotic trance flames put you in, when something cut through the usual forest noise. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a murmur, so soft I thought I was imagining it. But after a few seconds, I realized it had a rhythm, the rise and fall of actual speech. "Do you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. Caleb paused mid-sip from his flask, listening. "Hear what?" I held up a hand. "Shh, just listen." The fire popped, and for a moment I thought the sound had stopped. Then it came again. Low, urgent whispers. Not quite a hiss, but close. There was a cadence to it, like someone speaking quickly, the words pressed together. But the language, it wasn't English, wasn't anything I recognized. Caleb glanced toward the hollow, his brow furrowing. "Could be other campers," he said, though his tone was more guess than certainty. "Out here, we didn't see another car for miles." The voices were coming from deep inside the hollow, somewhere past the black wall of trees where our firelight died. At first they stayed steady, a distant thread of sound. Then they started getting closer. We both stood without really talking about it. Caleb grabbed the flashlight from his pack, but I shook my head. "Don't shine it." "Why not?" "I don't know. Just don't." The whispers grew clearer, though the words, if they were words, made no sense. Every syllable was slippery, running into the next, but there was intent in the tone, a sharpness that made the hair on my arms rise. Caleb's eyes darted to mine. "They're coming this way." We didn't discuss it. We just started packing, fast. The sleeping bags got shoved into their stuff sacks, tent stakes yanked from the ground with none of the care we'd taken earlier. I threw dirt over the fire until it hissed into darkness. The voices were close now, maybe 30 yards off, still hidden by the trees. And then, silence. Not fading away, not moving past, just gone. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. We stood there in the dark, our gear half-packed, straining to hear anything. The quiet was worse than the whispers had been. "Let's go," Caleb muttered, and I nodded. We slung our packs on and started toward the trail we'd come in on. We hadn't gone more than 10 steps when I saw it, movement just beyond the tree line to our right. At first I thought it was one person, crouched low, but then another shape moved behind it, and another. 3 figures in total, all staying low to the ground, their movements slow, deliberate. The moon was thin that night, but what little light filtered through caught their faces, pale, almost colorless against the dark. They didn't blink, didn't speak, just shifted slowly, circling, keeping just inside the trees. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but we didn't. We walked, fast but steady, keeping our eyes forward. I could feel them pacing us, the way you can sense a dog following at the edge of your vision. Every few seconds I caught another glimpse, a flash of white face, the glint of an eye. We didn't break into a run until the truck was in sight. Even then, we didn't stop to look back. Caleb had the keys in hand, and we were moving before the doors were fully shut. The road out was rough, and the headlights kept catching the trunks of trees, throwing shadows that seemed to shift too quickly. Neither of us said a word until we hit the blacktop. When we finally stopped for gas back in town, Caleb lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. The part that stuck with me isn't the whispers or the pale faces. It's how quiet they were. No crunch of leaves, no snapping twigs, even when they moved. Like the forest itself didn't want anyone to hear them. I've been back to the mountains since, but never to that hollow. Sometimes, late at night, I'll be out on the porch and swear I hear that same cadence in the wind. A low, urgent whisper in a language I'll never understand. And every time, I feel that same cold weight settle in my chest, the way it did out there when we realized we weren't alone. 7, the crawl space, beneath the floorboards. When I think back on that week in the mountains, I remember the cold more than anything. Not the kind that creeps in through your jacket seams, but the kind that sits deep in your chest. Like you've swallowed something that's not meant to be there. My friend, Daniel, had inherited the cabin from his uncle, who'd passed away a few years back. It was an old place, slouched a little to one side from decades of mountain weather, surrounded by a thick wall of pine that seemed to keep the wind out and the shadows in. He'd asked me to help him with renovations, replace a few boards, patch up the roof, maybe get the old wood stove working again. I said yes, figuring it would be a good excuse to get out of the city for a while. I didn't expect to find anything under that floor. The first day was nothing but sweeping out dust and mouse droppings. The boards groaned under every step, and you could feel the cabin's age in your knees. We were pulling up a section near the back bedroom when I noticed one board was looser than the rest. It wasn't warped like the others. It had given, like it had been lifted before. I wedged the claw of my hammer under it and pried it up. The nails slid out too easily. Beneath it was a square of darkness framed by splintered wood. A hatch. The hinges were rusted but not locked. Daniel came over, crouched beside me, and without saying anything, we both lifted it. The smell hit first. Wet earth, mold, something faintly sour. My flashlight cut into the black, revealing a shallow crawl space maybe 3 feet high, the dirt floor damp and uneven. I lowered the beam and saw it. An old quilt laid out flat, its fabric stiff with grime, a rusted tin cup, and a scatter of small bones white and brittle against the soil. Squirrel, maybe rabbit. I leaned closer and saw the walls, packed dirt, but smeared in places with dark stains. And on those walls, pressed into the earth, were handprints, dozens of them, some small, some larger, all pointing upward toward the hatch we were leaning over. Neither of us said much. Daniel's face was pale, and I could hear his breathing shift, slower, heavier. We didn't poke around any more than that. We just lowered the hatch, nailed the board back in place, and decided that section of the floor didn't need fixing. That night, the cabin settled with its usual pops and sighs, the wood shifting with the cold. We drank beer by the wood stove until the embers dulled, then turned in. I was sleeping on a cot in the back bedroom, the one with the loose board. The wind outside was constant, moving through the trees like water, and I drifted in and out of sleep to the sound of it. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. It wasn't the wind that did it. It was the silence. The kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. Then, from somewhere under me, I heard it. A faint scratching. Not frantic, but steady, deliberate, like something clawing at the underside of the floorboards. I held still, eyes on the ceiling, telling myself it was a raccoon, maybe a stray cat that had burrowed in from outside. But the sound didn't move around. It stayed in one spot, directly beneath where I lay. Scratch, pause, scratch. I must have stayed awake for an hour listening to it. Eventually, it stopped and the wind picked back up. I convinced myself it had been my imagination. The next day, Daniel barely mentioned it. He just asked if I'd slept all right, his tone casual but his eyes avoiding mine. We worked outside most of the day, replacing shingles on the roof, and by the time the sun went down, I was sore and tired enough to think I'd sleep through anything. But that night, I woke up again. This time, the scratching was quicker, almost impatient. I sat up, listening. It stopped the second I moved. I swung my legs off the cot and pressed my bare feet to the cold floor. Nothing. I waited, then slowly lay back down. Scratch. I didn't sleep after that. By the third night, I was running on fumes. The scratching came back, but now there was something else, faint, muffled, a sound like breathing, slow, deliberate, almost controlled. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I didn't move, barely even blinked. And then, from under the bed, I heard the soft thump of something brushing against the boards. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When I got up, I checked the hatch again, but the nails we'd put in were undisturbed. The dust around it was the same, no sign of entry. Daniel suggested we skip work that day and go for a hike. He didn't say it, but I think he wanted both of us out of the cabin. That afternoon, we ended up talking to a man at the tiny general store down in the hollow. He was in his 60s, wearing a frayed flannel and a ball cap stained with sweat. When we mentioned the cabin, he looked at us a little too long before saying, that place was shut up for a reason. He told us about Daniel's uncle, about how he'd lived alone for years and stopped coming into town near the end. People said he'd started hearing things in the walls, claiming someone was living under the floor. Folks figured it was just mountain isolation messing with his head. But one winter, he nailed every door and window shut from the inside and wouldn't answer when neighbors came by. When someone finally forced their way in, the place was empty. No sign of him. The only odd thing was the dirt under the bedroom floor. It had been disturbed, like it had been dug out and filled in again. We didn't sleep much after hearing that. On our last night, the wind died completely, leaving the forest in a suffocating stillness. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to Daniel's slow breathing from the other room. Around 2 a.m, I heard it again, the scratching, louder now, closer. My skin prickled as it moved, tracing the length of the bed from one side to the other. Then it stopped. The breathing started right below me. I stared into the dark, every muscle in my body locked, until I felt, not heard, something press against the underside of the floor. Just a single, solid push upward, like testing a weak spot. My breath hitched, and I swear I felt the boards flex beneath me. Then, silence. When morning came, we didn't speak. We just packed our things and left, not bothering to lock the door behind us. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still think about those handprints in the dirt, about how they were all pointing upward. And I wonder if we'd left that hatch open, whether something would have climbed out. 8. The figure at the edge of the firelight. I had been camping alone for years, but this trip felt different from the start. I'd picked a remote site deep in the mountains, far enough off the trail that it didn't show up on the usual maps. There was no service out here, no hum of distant roads, not even the faint drone of planes overhead. It was the kind of quiet where your ears start making up noises just to fill the gap. I had told myself I wanted the isolation, but the truth was, even as I hiked in, there was a strange heaviness to the air, the kind that settles into your bones before you have a chance to name it. The days were easy enough. I spent them wandering the ridgelines, collecting firewood, and fishing in a narrow creek that snaked through the hollow. But when the sun dropped behind the mountains, the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. The trees here were older than anywhere else I'd camped. Huge, gnarled trunks with bark like alligator skin, their branches knitting together so tightly above that even the moonlight struggled to reach the forest floor. When the wind moved through them, it sounded less like leaves rustling and more like the low murmur of a crowd you couldn't quite hear clearly. By last night, I had everything packed except for my sleeping bag, my stove, and the little fire I'd built up in the ring of stones near the center of camp. It had been a cold day, and the temperature was dropping fast. I sat cross-legged on the ground, cooking the last of my fish, and staring into the flames. The firelight flickered in the black walls of the surrounding forest, illuminating only a few yards past my tent before giving up entirely to the dark. It was when I stood to toss another branch on the fire that I caught movement, just at the very edge of that light. My first thought was deer. The shape was low to the ground, moving in a slow, careful way, pausing between each step. I'd seen deer plenty of times at night while camping. Their eyes would usually catch the firelight in a quick flash before they bounded off, but this one didn't. I squinted, leaning slightly to try to get a better view without stepping closer. The shape swayed, as if it had stopped to test the air. Then, with a slow and unnatural grace, it rose. Not onto 4 legs, but 2. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever met, and thin in a way that made my stomach knot. Its arms hung low, too low, nearly to its knees. In the shifting orange light, I could make out no details of a face, just a suggestion of a head angled slightly downward, staring in my direction. It didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I fed more wood into the fire until it crackled and spat, the flames climbing higher, trying to push the light farther out into the darkness. For a moment, the figure stayed exactly where it was, swaying faintly, like a branch in a wind I couldn't feel. I thought maybe the firelight would catch it fully now, give me a better look. But when I glanced back up, it was gone. The air felt heavier now. My pulse was loud in my ears. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a tired mind seeing what it wanted to see in the uneven shadows. But then I heard it, a faint shift in the leaves. Something was moving, slow and deliberate, circling. The sound wasn't constant. It would fade into stillness, long enough for me to think maybe it had stopped entirely, then start again from another direction, always just outside the reach of the firelight. I turned my camp chair toward the noise, then away again as it shifted behind me. My hands were clenched tight around the arms without me realizing. The longer it went on, the more it felt like it wasn't simply wandering. It was pacing, testing. I threw more wood onto the fire, more than I needed, until the flames roared. My campsite glowed orange and hot, shadows writhing on the trees. I stayed like that for hours, just sitting there, waiting for it to come closer or go away. It did neither. The wind picked up after midnight, the trees groaning as if something was pushing through them. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement again, low, darting, then upright, but never close enough to see clearly. My sleeping bag stayed rolled up in the tent. I didn't dare lie down. Sometime in the early hours, the circling stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, it rang in my ears. I sat still, my eyes scanning the tree line, the fire now low again, hissing quietly. I thought maybe it was finally over. That's when I realized there were no night sounds at all. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just a hollow, empty quiet that seemed to press in on me. I don't remember deciding to leave the fire. I just found myself standing, pack slung over one shoulder, every muscle in my body coiled tight. I backed slowly toward the trail, keeping the dwindling light between me and the dark. About 20 yards out, I turned for the first time, looking down the narrow path that would take me to the main trail by morning. That's when I saw it again. Not at the camp, but closer, just behind a pair of trees, watching. I didn't wait. I walked fast, then faster until my legs were aching and my breath came sharp in the cold air. Every time I glanced back, the path was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped, if I hesitated, it would be there again. I didn't stop until the first grey of dawn touched the tops of the mountains. I never saw it clearly. I never heard it speak or run or breathe, but the sound of those leaves shifting, slow, careful, deliberate, still plays in my head sometimes when the wind moves just right. And the worst part isn't wondering what it was. It's knowing that whatever it was, it stayed just out of sight on purpose.